Hello and welcome to this session on AniMark's Livestock Global Assurance Program, or LGAP. This session will focus on how traceability systems used by operators and facilities can become certified under LGAP. I'm Elizabeth Bradley, the Program Operations Manager at AniMark, and I'll be your facilitator. If you haven't already done so, there are 3 prerequisite courses that you should watch before completing this session. Many of the concepts discussed in this session are based on the information found in the Overview of LGAP, LGAP in Practice, and the AniMark Conformance System. This session won't go into the detail on the aspects covered in these foundational sessions, so it's important to watch these before watching this session. The agenda for this session will include an overview of LGAP and ESCAS and how traceability works. Then we'll look at the LGAP standards, which are applicable to traceability system providers, and how these providers can go about obtaining certification. Firstly, let's have an overview of LGAP. The Livestock Global Assurance Program is AniMark's flagship conformity and assessment certification program for businesses which export, import, manage, and process livestock. It is applicable to any of these organisations in any industry, anywhere in the world, wanting to demonstrate their commitment to ethical and sustainable animal welfare, husbandry, and management practices. LGAP applies to cattle, buffalo, sheep, and goats intended for slaughter. LGAP aims to foster world's best practice, encourage continual improvement, and provide assurances that standards are in place and are being applied. LGAP has been developed based on science, research, and international precedent. Tracing animals as they move through supply chains is critical to assuring that appropriate treatment of livestock is maintained. Livestock traceability also underpins animal health, disease control, food safety, and product integrity. Under LGAP, participants are called certified entities, and there's a few different types. Firstly, we have operators, who include the exporters and importers. Next, we have facilities, which are the feedlots, farms, and abattoirs. And lastly, we have traceability system providers, who provide traceability systems. Australia's live export industry is made up of supply chains consisting of producers and exporters in Australia, and importers, feedlots, farms, and abattoirs in importing countries. Exporters are subject to Australian government regulations. The Australian Standard for the Export of Livestock, or ASIL, which governs the sourcing, aggregation, and transport of livestock from Australia. And the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, or ESCAS, which governs the management of exported livestock once they reach their intended importing country. In order to export livestock, the exporter needs to demonstrate to the Australian government that the feedlots, farms, and abattoirs in its supply chains are meeting the requirements of ESCAS. These requirements relate to animal welfare, control, and traceability. Control and traceability is ensuring the flow of animals through the supply chain is controlled and animals can be traced along the way. To verify this, exporters, or in some cases importers, engage external auditors to undertake audits of transport arrangements, feedlots or farms, and the abattoirs in their supply chains. The auditors provide these reports back to exporters, who submit them to the Australian Government's Department of Agriculture. ESCAS is made up of quite a few components. LGAP essentially reorganises this information into the certification requirements, which consist of standards and the program rules. These documents outline clear and unambiguous requirements that must be met in order to be certified under LGAP. In addition, there are a number of resources available to support businesses gaining and maintaining certification. This includes an IT system called the AniMark Conformance System, which is a powerful tool to aid businesses in monitoring their ongoing conformity with the certification requirements, as well as guidance, templates, and training. Previously, I mentioned ESCAS, which includes requirements related to control and traceability. Control relates to ensuring there are vertical integration or contractual arrangements in place, control of all supply chain arrangements, and measures in place to ensure livestock remain within the approved supply chain. Traceability, however, relates to the ability to trace or account for all livestock until death, and ensuring that livestock only went to facilities within the approved supply chain. Let's have a little bit more of a deeper look at what traceability actually is. So consider this supply chain. Traceability is the ability to identify an animal or a group of animals in the case of sheep or goats, and record and track that animal's movement through identified sites. In this example, we have animal ID 123. We need the ability to track when animal ID 123 moves from site W into site X, and be confident that it's the same animal which comes out of site X, goes into site Y, and ends up at site Z. And we need to record that tracking on some sort of register. The process of maintaining movement records at a single facility is called internal traceability. Each facility is individually responsible for its own internal traceability. They must maintain their own records for how animals on site arrived and where they've gone to. Facilities need to share information with supply chain partners to enable end-to-end traceability. The linking of facilities' internal traceability data is called external traceability. That section was focused on understanding LGAP, the Australian regulatory framework it works within, how traceability fits under ESCAS, and the fundamental aspects that enable animals to be traced through a supply chain. This next part of this training will provide an overview of the LGAP standards. There are 5 standards under LGAP. LGAP 1000 is Fundamentals and Vocabulary, which contains the terms and definitions used throughout LGAP. LGAP 1001 contains requirements for animal welfare and management. LGAP 1002 is all about management system requirements. LGAP 1003 applies only to operators and is all about chain of custody. And of course, LGAP 1004, Traceability System requirements. However, this session is all about LGAP 1004, so we're going to focus there for a moment. LGAP 1004 applies to traceability systems used by operators and facilities under LGAP. Traceability systems are provided by traceability system providers. These providers may be an operator using their own in-house system, or providing that system to downstream operators and facilities to use. It could also be a facility using their own system, or an external third party providing the system to operators and facilities. We'll explore the different types of traceability system providers in just a little while. LGAP 1004 has been integrated into the existing LGAP framework. There are 2 pathways to achieve certification of your traceability system depending on your supply chain arrangements. If you have an internal system, you can voluntarily opt to have your system approved under LGAP 1004. Alternatively, if you use a third-party provider, you may request them to have their traceability system voluntarily approved under 1004. Third-party providers need to meet the requirements of 1004 and provisions in 1002 management systems. The benefits to traceability system providers in having their systems approved or certified include the opportunity to standardise performance in livestock traceability in each market. As LGAP standards provide clear, unambiguous requirements and how each party is expected to perform, it's clear in the LGAP certification rules. The standards ensure requirements are placed on parties responsible for conformity. A system user is responsible for appropriate use of the system, while a system provider is responsible for ensuring the system operates correctly. Consequences in the form of nonconformities are then assigned to the correct party responsible. There are requirements that will help you detect issues before they become nonconformities. This will also help deter nonconformities from occurring. LGAP is based on the concept of continual improvement. Participation in the program helps providers improve their operations and systems over time. And a system certification status under LGAP can be communicated to clients and prospective clients to provide reassurance and secure business. That section provided an overview of the LGAP standards. Our next section will look at the fundamentals of traceability system certification. The first standard we'll cover is LGAP1004. We'll also provide an overview of the terms used in LGAP1004 that are defined in LGAP1000. Previously, we saw how different standards apply to different entities. Now we're going to have a look at LGAP1004. LGAP1004 applies to traceability system providers, whether they are systems provided by operators or facilities or by third-party suppliers. It is designed to standardize the performance of traceability systems used in market. 1004 has been written to allow for voluntary adoption, but there is also an opportunity for mandatory adoption if the industry chooses to do so. Like all standards, 1004 is outcomes focused and does not prescribe any one specific system or technology. It also allows for the mob-based identification of sheep and goats. LGAP 1004 has three key elements: the traceability system provider, the traceability system itself, which comprises of the business processes and the rules, as well as the technologies that support the system. And third, the third element relates to how the system is used. There are a few key definitions found in LGAP 1000 that clarify the application of 1004. We'll work through these in more detail now. So, the traceability system provider refers to a company or person who provides or supplies the traceability system. Under LGAP, this could be a third-party provider, an exporter, importer, or a facility. The traceability system provider can be operators and facility who supply and use their own system or provide it to others to use. For example, some exporters have developed their own vertically integrated systems and supply that system and equipment to their supply chain partners. Alternatively, they may be third-party providers who provide a system to operators and facilities to use, with or without traceability services. Traceability system refers to the system used to trace animals. A system is not prescribed as an electronic or software system, rather a group of interacting rules and processes that meet the outcome of tracing animals. Remember previously we talked about internal and external traceability. Well, you essentially have systems that manage internal or external traceability, or they could do both. We'll cover both traceability services and user together as they're related. Traceability services refers to instances where a system provider also uses the system. That is, they have staff on site who are identifying animals and recording data, checking and verifying data, and sending reports. A user is an individual person who uses the traceability system, including using resources or undertaking activities. A user could be a person internal to the operator facility, such as an employee or a contractor. A user could also be personnel provided by an external traceability system provider where they are providing traceability services. So just a note here to help define the difference between why internal and external personnel are considered under LGAP 1004. A system standard defines requirements for systems. There then needs to be requirements which make sure the system is used properly. A system provider cannot be held responsible for the system not being used correctly. It is important to ensure that the nonconformities rest with the parties responsible. The last term we'll look at is register, which is where traceability data and details are stored. Registers are a simple way to collect and store identification and movement information, connect information, and share information with trading partners. They may be manual spreadsheets, or they may be more sophisticated like relational databases. A few more key terms we need to look at before we get into requirements are traceability location, which refers to geographical location where animals are kept, reared, housed, gathered, or temporarily handled. So this may mean a feedlot or a depot or an abattoir. Traceability party relates to the entity that has either ownership or physical custody of the individual animal or group of animals at a traceability location, and as they move between traceability locations. This may be the same location, but in some cases there may be two different entities. Master level event refers to the first movement of an animal or group of animals into the originating traceability location. This is usually going to be by way of birth or importation. It's important to note that the scope of LGAP as applied to the live export industry does not include breeding livestock. However, this can be utilised if the system is to trace animals for more than live export compliance. Critical movement event refers to the entry or exit of an animal or group of animals into or out of a traceability location. This is considered critical to record. And transaction event refers to the exchange between traceability parties where the physical custody or ownership of an animal or group of animals changes. This may occur in a feedlot or abattoir. In terms of how LGAP 1004 is structured, it has 12 different sections. Sections 1 to 3 relate to the scope, normative references, and definitions. The operational requirements relate to what the system needs to do and how it needs to operate. Section 4 defines the purpose and operation of the system. Section 5 contains requirements on the resources required to operate the system, including human resources. Section 6 has requirements around infrastructure and equipment. Section 7 contains identification requirements for locations and different parties. Section 8 outlines the identification requirements for animals. Section 9 details the requirements for recording animal movements. Section 10 outlines use of registers. Section 11 provides requirements for verification, monitoring, and reporting. Section 12 is the bibliography. And in addition, there are 4 annexes which contain information on personnel competencies, key data elements which are required to be captured for various events, and how to conduct traceability tests. When you read LGAP 1004, it's important to understand the that different requirements apply depending on your scope of activities. Some requirements apply to all system provider types. Other requirements may only apply to a subset of system providers, in particular, those providers who also provide traceability services. The applicability provisions can be found in bold capital letters at the top and within each section. There are additional requirements for traceability system providers that also provide traceability services. Additional requirements for traceability system providers with supply chain traceability systems, and additional requirements for traceability system providers with supply chain traceability systems that also provide traceability services. This next section will focus on some key components from LGAP 1004. We won't go through each requirement in detail. This just focuses on the main areas that are most likely to be of interest. The standard has been designed to ensure the fundamentals to all traceability systems are embedded. We discussed these previously, and they relate to site identification, livestock identification, interoperability, or the ability to connect data between facilities, and a register, so for example, a database. Let's just focus on the term interoperability first. Individual systems need to share data. Under LGAP 1004, this is considered interoperability. Even if each individual system is provided by a different entity, the data must be able to be shared in some way so that an animal can be traced through the entire supply chain. LGAP 1004 doesn't mandate a sharing method, but rather just requires that where data is required to be shared, the system does not prevent this from occurring. The primary purpose of the system is to trace animals. Under 1004, there are timeframes that underpin that purpose of the system. A traceability system must enable animals to be traced one step forward and one step back within 10 days of starting a tracing effort. That means where the animals have come from and where they have gone to, which might include death for slaughter. For systems used within a supply chain, this extends to animals being traced along the entire supply chain within 10 days. Another key component in 1004 is that traceability system providers are responsible for developing processes for their system. These processes are the ones that users of the system are responsible for implementing and adhering to. Remember, a user may be an internal person at an operator or facility, or it may be someone who is provided by the traceability system provider. There is a clear distinction in LGAP 1004 as to who is responsible for the development of processes, i.e., how to use the system, and who is responsible for adhering to these processes, so actually using the system. The next key component I want to talk about is supporting evidence. Supporting evidence is not required for all traceability system providers. However, where it is required, there are particular requirements that supporting evidence must meet. Supporting evidence relates to evidence that demonstrates an animal was present in a particular traceability location at a particular time or day, and that a particular process occurred to that animal. For example, this might apply in an abattoir, where photos are required to be taken, so a form of static visual imagery, to confirm time and date and location of slaughter. The main point of the requirement is to ensure evidence is accurate and able to be used should any questions arise as to the location of the animal at any point in time. The traceability system provider must have processes in place for how users conduct monitoring and reporting. They must also have processes which they follow for monitoring, such as ensuring the system is working. For those persons who are using the system, they must implement the processes that are established by the traceability system provider and keep relevant evidence. They then must monitor for particular incidents using the processes established. Where incidents, that is, very bad things happen, they must then review, correct, and report those. They then must use the evidence kept to undertake analysis on everything else that isn't an incident in a specific time frame, which is based on the internal audit frequency. They then have to review the outcome of the analysis, and if there are more issues, correct it if you can and report it. And lastly, where deviations are noticed, they have to review, correct, and report. That section was focused on LGAP 1004. I'd like to now provide an overview of LGAP 1002, which is the other standard that traceability system providers need to fulfill in order to be certified under LGAP. LGAP 1002 is the only other LGAP standard that includes requirements for traceability system providers. LGAP 1002 is the management system standard. It's also applicable to operators and facilities. As I've mentioned before, using the system is a critical concept. If facilities or operators are using the system, they have to do it correctly and be responsible for doing so. There are new clauses in LGAP 1002 that set out requirements for how the system is used by operators and facilities. If the system is used incorrectly, then non-conformities will be assigned to the operator or facility under 1002. For example, if a facility fails to follow the usage requirements, which are set by the traceability system provider, then they incur the non-conformity, not the traceability system provider. This is the foundation that allows for the equitable distribution of responsibility throughout the supply chain. Noting this is slightly different where the traceability system provider also provides traceability services, so is the system user. Traceability system providers need to meet the applicable management system requirements in 1002. These requirements relate to risk management, documented information, internal auditing, and corrective action where non-conformities occur. For example, providers of systems, these requirements are good practice and necessary to ensure they adhere to the non-conformity management and continual improvement approach LGAP has been based upon. For operators and facility who are also system providers, these simply build upon their existing management system requirements under LGAP. So rather than duplicating having two management systems, you just include it with your operator or facility one. As they already have to meet the management system standard, they simply add their role as system provider to their management system scope. For example, if a facility was certified as a feedlot and met the management system requirements, but AniMark later introduced requirements for feed manufacturing, which included management system requirements, a facility who produced their own feed could accommodate this by adding feed manufacturing under their management system for LGAP. When you read LGAP 1002, it's important to understand that different requirements apply depending on your scope of activities. There are general requirements for operators, facilities, and traceability system providers. Then you will find a subset of requirements. Additional requirements for operators and facilities using traceability systems approved under 1004. These are not applicable to traceability system providers. There are additional requirements for operators using traceability systems approved under LGAP 1004. These are not applicable to traceability system providers. Additional requirements for all operators and traceability system providers are applicable to traceability system providers. And additional requirements for importer operators, all facilities, and traceability system providers with traceability services. These are applicable to traceability system providers. There are 8 sections in LGAP 1002, and they relate to management systems, leadership and responsibility, processes and risk, documented information, monitoring, management review, internal audit, non-conformity, and corrective actions. So that provided an overview of the 2 standards applicable to traceability system providers. This next section will provide an overview of the certification pathway, and then we'll look at some of the requirements in the standards in more detail. In order to become certified under LGAP, there are a series of steps you need to follow, which start with an application and self-assessment process, and then a process through internal and external audit. You might also need to manage non-conformities before being awarded certification. Certification is awarded for 3 years and requires ongoing surveillance activities to be undertaken. Primarily, this is through internal and external audits. The frequency of internal and external audits are based on the traceability system provider's risk rating. The pathway to certification, as well as the frequency of audits, is the same process under LGAP that operators and facilities follow. At each external audit, an approved auditor will conduct a risk assessment, and the outcome is a risk rating. Risk ratings are categorised as low, medium, or high. Low risk means that internal audits will occur every 4 months and external audits occur every 12 months. Medium risk requires internal audits to be conducted every 3 months and external audits to be conducted every 6 months. High risk means internal audits are to be conducted monthly and external audits are conducted every 3 months. The risk rating is assigned to each traceability system provider as part of the certification decision. The risk rating, just like the certification decision, can also be appealed if the traceability system provider feels it's not representative. The traceability system provider can improve their risk rating by improving their processes, procedures, and practices. Let's touch on an internal audit. It's important to be aware of who can conduct internal audits. Internal auditors must be appointed by the traceability system provider and can be a member of staff or an external party, which could be someone from an independent organisation you contract to undertake internal audits. There is some specific criteria that all internal auditors must meet. They need to have the relevant skills and knowledge to conduct internal audits, and of course, they need to understand the certification requirements. They also need to have attended the LGAP training course provided by AniMark before they conduct their first internal audit. Internal auditors also need to be impartial. This means they can't audit their own area of responsibility or an area in which they've contributed through by providing services, products, technology, training, or consultation. They can't be associated either with the approved certification body or approved auditor. LGAP 1002 provides information about the knowledge and skills required to be an internal auditor under LGAP. During the internal audit process, the auditor will answer a series of questions relating to the business. This will require the internal auditor to look at the paperwork, interview people, review previous internal and external audit outcomes, conduct traceability tests, and where relevant, observe traceability activities such as operating infrastructure or equipment, performing reconciliations, capturing traceability data, and supporting evidence. The questions the internal auditor answers are provided in a checklist on the AniMark Conformance System and requires a yes or no response. In general, yes means they're conforming and no means they're not. The internal auditor then completes the checklist, records their observations and comments, and uploads any evidence to support their findings. This evidence could include copies of documents or pictures, and it's all undertaken using the AniMark Conformance System. When the internal auditor answers no to a question to indicate that there is a nonconformity, the AniMark Conformance System will raise a nonconformity that can then be completed in the system once it's been corrected. We'll discuss what happens with nonconformities in that situation in a little bit more detail further in the session. External audits are managed by certification bodies. These certification bodies and their auditors are approved by AniMark to provide assurance services under LGAP. Once a traceability system provider applies to become certified, AniMark will allocate that business to an approved certification body who will then assign one of their approved auditors to undertake the external audit. The external audit process is similar to the internal audit process in that the approved auditor will undertake a number of tasks to determine conformity with the LGAP certification requirements. This requires the approved auditor to review documentation, records, procedures, and processes, as well as previous internal audit outcomes. The approved auditor will also interview people on site to confirm their understanding of processes, conduct traceability tests to confirm that the traceability system does indeed do traceability, and where relevant, observe traceability activities occurring. The approved auditor completes the external audit and records outcomes using the AniMark IT Conformance System in the same way the internal auditor does. This includes uploading any supporting evidence such as documents or pictures and recording their observations in the system. An important aspect to LGAP is the focus on continual improvement. This is evident through the approach taken to nonconformity management. It is expected that nonconformities will occur. The focus is on how these are identified and corrected, rather than that they have occurred. As we heard earlier, nonconformities will be identified through the auditing process, either as part of an internal audit or an external audit when you undertake initial or ongoing surveillance activities. It's also important to note that nonconformities could be raised through other means, such as in response to a complaint or as part of an investigation. So let's now look at how nonconformities are defined as either minor, major, or critical. A minor nonconformity is where a requirement has not been met, but where the traceability system provider is capable of meeting it. A major nonconformity is where the ability of the traceability system provider to meet the requirement is adversely affected, which results in or has the potential to result in the loss of animal traceability or a failure to identify or acknowledge nonconformities and take corrective actions. A critical nonconformity is where the ability of the traceability system provider to meet requirements is prevented, which results in the loss of animal traceability or a systematic and repeated failure to identify or acknowledge nonconformities and take corrective action. When auditors classify nonconformities, there is a framework they use which is outlined in the certification rules. Let's have a look through this, and we'll look at the actions which need to be taken in timeframes and what happens if action is not taken. In categorising nonconformity as either minor, major, or critical, the auditor considers the impact and the prevalence of the event. The certification rules define welfare and traceability impacts, as well as the impacts related to management systems or paperwork. The main nonconformities for traceability system providers will relate to those which have an impact on traceability rather than animal welfare. A high traceability impact means circumstances in which animals cannot be traced, are deliberately moved outside of the supply chain to an uncertified site, or they escape and the fate of the animal is not known. A moderate traceability impact means circumstances in which animals are moved without the knowledge of the operator or facility to an uncertified site, or where animals escape and the fate of the animal is known. The final impact considers issues related to the traceability system provider's management system or paperwork, but excludes systems or paperwork issues related to traceability, as these are considered under the traceability impact. The second consideration when assessing the degree of nonconformity is the prevalence of the event. It's not necessarily the number of times an event occurs or the number of animals or people involved, and this is stepped out clearly in the certification rules. Instead, prevalence considers if the event can be defined as infrequent, numerous, or systemic. Infrequent means for a small number or occurrences of people, for which procedure is in place to prevent occurrence, or management intervention occurs and corrective action is applied. Numerous means more than one person or multiple occurrences, so not multiple animals, for where a procedure is in place to prevent occurrence and management intervention occurs, but only after multiple occurrences and is corrective action applied. Systemic occurs, and it may only occur once, but there's no system in place to prevent it from occurring again, or no management intervention at all, and there is either no system or it's ingrained behaviour of the personnel. The auditor uses the definitions and categorisation framework to determine the nonconformity as you would see in front of you. For example, a high traceability impact which occurs numerously would be a major nonconformity, whereas if it were to be considered systemic, then it would be deemed a critical nonconformity. An example of a major nonconformity would be if an auditor performed a traceability test on a supply chain system and it demonstrated that animals were unable to be located through numerous supply chains because a process of the traceability system provider was not clear on requirements of the system. The correction would be that the process was updated and the traceability system provider explained the changes to their supply chain partners. When a nonconformity is identified, it is important that action is taken. Taking action to rectify a nonconformity involves a number of steps. In many cases, you'll need to react to the nonconformity immediately. This is called making a correction. You would then need to look at the underlying cause of the nonconformity. For example, was the process not clear enough to ensure the person responsible was performing the process correctly? Once you've identified the cause of the nonconformity, you need to take corrective action to eliminate that cause. You will then need to continue to monitor and review the effectiveness of the corrective action. And sometimes you may need to make wholesale changes to the system itself or other processes. You also need to retain appropriate records to demonstrate that corrective action was taken and has been effective. The corrective action would need to be recorded in the AniMark Conformance System against the nonconformity, and the auditor would determine if corrective action taken is sufficient to close out the nonconformity. If it is, the auditor will make these changes in the system and you'll be notified. And remember, when nonconformities are identified, there are timeframes in which the nonconformity has to be resolved and closed out in the AniMark Conformance System. If the auditor determines the corrective action is not sufficient to eliminate the root cause of the nonconformity and prevent reoccurrence, or if no action is taken in the required timeframe, then the auditor will escalate the nonconformity. This means that a minor nonconformity which is not corrected in 30 days will be escalated to a major. If a major is not corrected in 7 days, it will be escalated to a critical nonconformity. AniMark has an obligation to keep the Australian Government updated in relation to critical nonconformities. Once certified, it is important to ensure corrective action is undertaken, because if the critical nonconformity is not resolved, the Traceability System Provider certification will be at risk as the escalation process extends further than nonconformities. This can lead to the suspension of a certification or ultimately the withdrawal of certification. If a nonconformity is critical, it must be closed out within 3 days of being identified. Suspension occurs if a critical nonconformity is not closed out within this timeframe. After a traceability system provider has had their certification suspended, they have 30 days to rectify the reason for suspension. At this point in time, an approved auditor must undertake another on-site audit to determine if the suspension can be lifted. If the suspension remains after 30 days, then certification is withdrawn. Now that we've gone through the overview of the certification pathway and how certification can be obtained and maintained, there are videos available from the AniMark website that provide more details on these processes. This next section will look at how traceability system providers can demonstrate conformity with the standards. So we'll run through some scenarios. To start with, we'll look at a few different scenarios in terms of how the standards would be applied. We're going to use different terms we went over previously in these scenarios. Remember, these relate to different types of traceability system providers, different types of traceability systems, and different ways the system can be used. The first scenario we will look at relates to traceability system providers being an operator or facility using their own system. In this case, the system is an internal system and can be used by internal personnel. As you can see, each traceability system provider provides its own system, and then, as shown in the example, internal staff use the system to undertake traceability activities such as recording animal movements in or out of the feedlot or abattoir. Our next scenario relates to traceability system providers to provide a supply chain traceability system. In this case, the operator, let's say an exporter, supplies all facilities in its supply chain with the same system to use. Each facility in the supply chain allocate their own personnel to perform the traceability activities within their site, such as scanning animals into and out of the feedlot or abattoir. An alternative to this case is where the exporter also allocates personnel to each facility to perform the traceability services, such as scanning animals. In this scenario, the system receives information from all parties in the supply chain using the one system. Our final scenario is one in which a third-party traceability system provider provides a system for use through the supply chain and may provide traceability services. In this case, the system may be used by staff at each facility or by external personnel provided by the third party to perform traceability services. In this scenario, all of the information from throughout the supply chain is managed through the third-party system, and traceability activities are undertaken within each facility by facility staff. Or the system provider provides personnel to undertake traceability services within each facility. So that section was to explain different scenarios that exist within the livestock supply chain around traceability systems, their providers, and the people that use them. Importantly, when you're looking at different requirements in the standard, you can think about different scenarios to work out and what applies to your situation, and therefore which requirements apply. If you're ever unsure, you can always ask us at AniMark and we'll help you understand. So let's dive into a little bit about conforming with LGAP. The first section of LGAP1004 relates to ensuring the primary purpose of the system is focused on monitoring and tracking the movement of livestock through LGAP facilities. Earlier I mentioned there were timeframes related to the primary purpose of the system. This is the section where these apply. Essentially, it means the primary purpose of the system needs to be able to monitor and track the movement of livestock through LGAP facilities within 10 days. The next section in LGAP1004 relates to resources. An important point in this section is that traceability system providers can't be held responsible for resources if they have no control over them. Traceability system providers do need to ensure the personnel they require to run their own business, that is, develop, provide and support the system, are in place and are competent. For providers that purely provide a system, their responsibility under this section relates to ensuring there are processes in place for the entities using the system so they have the right type of resources necessary for the correct operation of the system. The responsibilities for implementing the resources therefore rest with the user of the system, which we know from previously could be a traceability system provider providing traceability services, or it could be an operator or facility's own personnel. So this is where there are specific requirements related to traceability system providers who provide traceability services, because they essentially become the users and have dual requirements to provide the processes and implement the processes. The next two sections cover identification of location and party. If you recall previously, we talked about fundamentals of traceability parties are to identify an animal, a party, and a location. These sections address requirements for location and party components. The method of identifying a location or party is not prescribed by the system and could be that the location or party is allocated a unique number in a database that correlates to an address, or it may be a GPS, a legal name, or something else. The point is to ensure the system can tell users the exact physical location of an animal so that it can be found and the party or entity who had the responsibility for the animal at that location. The next component of the standard relates to another fundamental requirement for an effective traceability system, and that is identification of the animal. This may be an individual animal or a group of animals. In this section, there are also requirements to identify the animal or group of animals, but also to ensure identifiers used are kept secure. This includes controlling their use and their disposal. The section on movement recording relates to how animals' entry or exit into or from a facility is recorded. Again, the method is not prescribed, but rather the outcome to be achieved is. This means the system may rely on manual recording or electronic recording. The next section relates to registers, which really is whatever is used to collect and store traceability data. The focus of this section is on ensuring however the data is collected and stored, it is done within the timeframes that allow the primary purpose to occur and in a manner that is secure. We discussed previously a register can be written records, spreadsheets, or a more sophisticated database, so long as the outcome can be demonstrated. A traceability system is only as good as the quality of data it collects and stores. An important aspect with any system is the data relied upon by that system is valid, reliable, and accurate, and that the system has the ability to verify this and also monitor and report on incidents. The focus in this section of the standard is having processes in place to verify the validity, reliability, and accuracy of traceability data. Again, this is where a traceability system provider is required to develop the process, but not necessarily implement the process unless they're providing the traceability services. This section also introduces supporting evidence, which we discussed earlier. This relates to ensuring processes are in place to collect the supporting evidence, so either records and information such as CCTV and photos. Again, it's important to bear in mind that supporting evidence is not required for all systems, and it may be specified by, say, AniMark, or an exporter might require it of a facility. Typically, this is done in response to a compliance requirement. Now that we've looked at how to conform with LGAP 1004, we'll look at some key parts in different sections of 1002 that you need to conform with. And don't forget that AniMark has developed guidance materials that will help you demonstrate conformity and understand the requirements. The first section in LGAP 1002 relates to leadership. There is one requirement which essentially says whoever is in charge of the business will demonstrate leadership and commitment to fulfilling the LGAP requirements. It then provides 6 points which would indicate that such leadership and commitment exists. These points relate to things like making sure you have documented information, making sure people know what they have to do, making sure the right equipment and infrastructure is available, looking at what happens in the operation, and fixing issues to ensure ongoing conformity. The next area is process, risk, and monitoring, which actually relates to a number of different subsections within the standard, but we've combined them into this one section because they're interrelated. When considered in combination, these requirements essentially mean you need to identify risks, have processes to manage these risks, monitor those processes, and verify the performance against the processes. Now, this is not meant to be an onerous process. It's all about thinking what could go wrong in my operation, which would impact my ability to remain certified. Where could things go wrong, and how do I minimize the chance of these things going wrong or eliminate the reasons for them going wrong? Monitoring and verifying in particular are part of an ongoing requirement for traceability system providers, rather than solely occurring during the external audit. That's because monitoring and verifying is part of a self-checking process to ensure day-to-day conformity with the requirements is maintained. Conformity should be assured day-to-day, not audit to audit. Now, not all requirements under documented information in 1002 apply to every traceability system provider. Under LGAP, documented information is any information required by a traceability system provider. It can include records and other documents such as standard operating procedures and work instructions, and can be paper or hard copy, or it could be even electronic. It could include IT systems and traceability systems because they also form part of documented information. Overall, the intent of this section of LGAP 1002 is to ensure there is documented information which is required by the standards, necessary to enable conformity, essential to effective implementation of your processes, and used to demonstrate conformity. Again, this is not about paperwork for the sake of paperwork. It's about making sure what needs to be done to conform with the standards is understood and done, and that there is evidence to prove this. There are 3 requirements under management review, and many organisations are probably already doing this, but it's probably called a different name. This is an area where the term top management occurs, and remember that this means whoever directs or controls a traceability system provider. What this section requires is that you should review your operation at least annually to identify areas requiring improvement so you can continually conform with the LGAP certification requirements overall. Detail is then provided as to what should be considered when undertaking such a review. For example, looking at your past internal and external audit results and considering if actions taken could be improved upon, and then actioning those improvements. For some, reviewing your management system regularly will be the business as usual. For others, this is an ongoing improvement opportunity to look at past performance and identify areas for improvement. It also means you'll pick up issues before they become critical. The remaining sections of the LGAP Standard 1002 relate to internal auditing and corrective actions. Looking at these in combination, they are saying you will need to undertake internal audits on a regular basis, and as we heard previously, the frequency of those is specified by risk rating allocated during external audits. Regular internal auditing is a form of self-checking to make sure the way you operate remains in conformity with the LGAP requirements. It is expected through the internal audit process you would identify non-conformities, and this is considered to be an opportunity for improvement, something to address issues before they become severe. If a non-conformity is identified, then you need to take action to fix the issue. Non-conformities may be identified through internal or external audits or as a result from feedback or a complaint. The AniMark Conformance System is the tool used to undertake internal audits and record the outcomes. The system has been designed to guide you through the process, and there's also training videos on how to use it, as well as guidance materials available. That last section provided an overview of LGAP 1002 and the key parts in different sections that traceability system providers need to conform with. Just a gentle reminder that we also have guidance materials and other training materials available online to help you understand all of the material. Before we close out this session, let's recap some important points. So certification for traceability systems is based on the type of traceability system provider, so who's providing the system. It could be an operator, facility, or a third party. The type of traceability system provided, whether it's an internal system or an external system, also known as a supply chain traceability system, and how the traceability system is used, so by personnel at the facility or by personnel who are provided by a third party or an exporter. Working through the type of provider, system, and use case will help you work out which requirements are applicable to your business and therefore what you need to do to gain and maintain certification. Traceability systems, their providers, and their users are complex. Certification under LGAP for traceability systems used by operators and facilities has been designed to be flexible enough to cover all types of systems, how they are provided, and the use cases. Whether a system is provided by an operator or a facility for their own internal use, whether it's provided by an operator or third party for use through a supply chain, and whether the system is used by internal personnel or external personnel, can all be accommodated under LGAP. AniMark has guidance manuals to provide guidance for conforming with the requirements, and of course the AniMark IT Conformance System, which you use to undertake internal audits and manage non-conformities. There are also plenty of training videos about LGAP and specific parts of LGAP such as the standards, internal audits, and IT Conformance System how-tos available from the AniMark website. The benefits of having traceability systems used by operators and facilities certified under LGAP include greater clarity for what effective traceability should look like, standardizing performance across all markets for traceability systems are used. Also, like other aspects of LGAP, 1004 provides equitable distribution of responsibility for traceability through the supply chain. Requirements of a use are placed on the users of the system, while requirements for system operation is placed on the provider of the system. Monitoring arrangements have also been included to help deter and detect potential nonconformities. And LGAP also accommodates all variations of systems, whether these are internal or external systems or provided by a facility for their own use, an operator to facilities in their supply chain, or a third party. It also doesn't prescribe a specific type of technology, meaning all types of systems can get certified. And finally, LGAP is a voluntary program that is focused on continual improvement. This allows you to demonstrate best practice and achieve recognition for this. You can then promote your certification status to prospective clients, helping to grow your business. That brings us to the end of the session on certifying systems under LGAP 1004. If there are any questions in relation to this session or you would like more information, please get in touch with us at AniMark at info@animark.com.au. Thank you.